Good morning to those on the West Coast and good afternoon to everyone in North America. And of course, good early, or sorry, I should say late afternoon to those in the UK, especially one of our guests, Shonagh Reid. And welcome to our latest edition of the Urban Equities Chats. My name is Andre Darmanin, the host of Urban Equity Chats webcasts. And for those who've been on, thanks for returning, and for those who are new, welcome aboard. So today's topic is a little bit near and dear to me. The reason being is because, over the last few years, I've kind of had this little, this kind of, how do you put it? Sort of some shaming, some sort of discomfort and whatnot, especially being of a mixed race background. Me being Trinidadian and my mother being Trinidadian, my dad being Maltese. And so, I said to myself, we keep on hearing about this imposter syndrome. What's that all about? I know that a lot of people have talked about it. And then I thought to myself, is there such a thing as racial imposter syndrome? And I'm like, there is actually a thing. And I looked it up and I even blogged about it, and I did post about it. I reposted the blog that I did on the skin I'm in. That's what it's called, and I'll repost the link, in the chat notes after this webcast is over. So I was thinking about it, and I'm like, who would be best to talk about this as well? And so Shonagh Reid from the UK and Jennisha Williams, who works at University of Waterloo. They are both, they're both immersed in this, and they both have lived experience with this. So I wanted to talk about this a little bit more with them, and share our stories, share strategies, and share and talk about it, and see what kind of strategies and what kind of solutions are there. From navigating those spaces to what equity practitioners could look for when it comes to this, when it comes to racial imposter syndrome, addressing it and finding solutions for that. So without further ado, let me just first start by giving a land acknowledgement, as I always do. And first I wanted to say that we acknowledge the land that we're meeting on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuits, and Métis. Acknowledge that the land that I stand on is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. So without further ado, I'm gonna give the floor to both Shonagh and Jennisha so that they can introduce themselves to the audience. So whoever wants to go ahead.
Go ahead, Jennisha. You go first.
Okay, awesome. Thanks so much. Hi, everyone joining the call today. My name is Jennisha Wilson, and I currently work as a senior manager for anti-racism response, but I do come with quite a bit of experience working in the EDI world and just on the intersections of anti-racism and anti-violence. Prior to kind of starting this new role in anti-racism, for an institution in Canada, I worked very closely with First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities in Ontario. And my most recent passion project was creating a project that was focused on supporting Indigenous women who are engaged in sex work, as well as those being human trafficked across Canada, access harm reduction resources and supports. And I'm really happy to be here and to chat about, my experience with racial imposter syndrome, but also hopefully be able to share some knowledge and some tips and resources around how to navigate that space and those experiences. And I'm hoping to hear from the audience as well as, things that we could learn from you attending today. I'll hand it over. Thanks.
Thanks, Jennisha. My name's Shonagh Reid. I'm based in the Midlands in England. I'm very pleased to be part of this webcast with both Andre and Jennisha today. In terms of my background, if we talk about origins, my father's Jamaican. He came over in what we call here the Windrush generation. So even though he wasn't on that first boat from Jamaica. He was part of that generation who came over here. My mother's Scottish, and somehow, thanks to her origins, I've ended up with a Irish name. So we're talking about quite a melting pot, really, in terms of my background, including an acknowledgement that the Jamaican population are made up of many people. And somewhere in there, you know, my grandmother was half Chinese. And I also have a Jewish relative too, on his side, on my father's side. So my background is in the arts and in education. I was an assistant principal as an educator up until last year, and also have worked with supporting Black, brown, global majority teachers. That's the terminology we use over here in the UK, and supporting them in their endeavours to progress and to enter the education world of work. That developed into a consultancy, and I now focus my consultancy in the arts and in education, working with a range of different organisations on their approach to diversity and inclusion. I also do a bit of blogging and other bits of writing too. It's really a pleasure to be here.
All right, thank you for that. Well, first of all, before anything, before I even start, I want to wish Shonagh a happy birthday. Her birthday was this week, so so everyone's going to give their claps and everything. So I want to do that. That's why I said I was going to wait until the to the webcast to actually say that. So there you go.
Thank
And so just to go with the format of this, I just want to say that this is a conversation. That's why I opened up all the rooms here. So if you want to join in on the conversation between the three of us, great. Either tell your stories or you know, share your thoughts or whatnot. So, you know, just put up your hand and let me know when you want to have the conversation, when you want to talk. Okay. So first of all, let me just, you know, if you're not sure what's racial imposter syndrome, you're just curious. Here's one quote that I found about racial imposter syndrome, defining it. It's the feeling of self-doubt when one's internal racial identity doesn't match others' perception of the racial identity, or the feeling when a multiracial or mixed race person doesn't believe that they belong to any part of their racial identity. So the feeling of being at home is often lost because individuals' lived experiences are more unique and complex than their monoracial counterparts or those with more homogenous culture. This makes it hard for an individual to connect and engage with the communities with which they identify. And I mean, I can speak to that. Even reading, you know, Shonagh had actually suggested one of the books, Mixed Other, by oh my God, what's her name? Her name is sorry. Natalie Morris. Yes, Natalie Morris. She's out of the UK, and she talks about her experience. And I've just started reading the book, and a lot of the stories that she had talked about, being navigating spaces and whatnot, was actually something that resonated with me. So, to the both of you, whoever wants to start, you know, tell us your story of how you've expressed or how you've experienced racial imposter syndrome, and you know, we'll go from there.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in and start. And I intentionally left my self-identifying with my origins for this portion of the conversation. So I'll share now. So I was born in Jamaica to parents who are my mom is West Indian and my dad is Black. And we were, I was partially raised in Jamaica up until a very young age, in which I immigrated to Canada with my parents when I was about 3 or 4. And I don't think that I fully understood the impact of what immigration would look like and feel like until folks essentially started to question if my parents were my parents, and how that has played into shaping of identities and belonging. So for folks who are from the Caribbean and may be able to relate, when you're from somewhere and folks ask you, you say, yeah, I'm Jamaican. And they'll and that is a normal way to respond to conversations and when you're meeting other folks from the islands. However, when that comes up in spaces in Western contexts like Canada, they'll ask, well, what part of you is Jamaican, or explain, or speak patois. And this essentially became the rhetoric of my experiences around racial imposter syndrome, where in spaces from a very young age, first it was, what kind of food are you eating? And why are you eating that food? You don't belong to the particular communities that would eat rice and peas, jerk chicken, oxtail, all these things that are very much known for a part of being Jamaican culture. And then it became a, well, you must be biracial, but or you born in Jamaica? Can you relate to the culture? Can you actually demonstrate that you are part of this space? And I think this is kind of the narrative that I've experienced quite a bit from a very young age, and into still experiencing it, right? Where when I say that I'm Indo, Afro, Jamaican, and I identify as being West Indian and Black, people will say, well, you're not Black enough to be Black based on the color of your skin. And for me, that's very difficult because my father, who is the Black member of my parental unit, has been very instrumental in my identity formation, in my growth as a young person, has been, I would consider the pillar in my family in terms of our education and our understanding of equity, anti-racism, and doing this work in this space of being immigrants to this country. So for me, racial imposter syndrome and the feeling and the fear of speaking up and saying, hey, I am Black to other folks who are also Black, comes with it this overwhelming feeling of shame, blame, and having to prove self. And having to prove self to folks who also don't come from the same intersections of being a woman who is who's more white presenting than other folks from the same community, but also who may not have the same origin stories. So folks who come from other spaces of Black origin may not have the same experiences as Jamaican, and in that of itself may also have a layer of you're still not Black enough, right? And having to walk through those spaces. So I'll stop there in terms of my sharing and my origin stories around my experiences for racial imposter syndrome, but I can definitely say the common feeling is feeling of shame, feeling of blame, feeling of having to prove self, and then questioning, do I have any legitimacy to actually speak up and say and identify as being West Indian and being Black? Am I allowed to do that because of the ways in which folks interact with me?
Yeah, I commend you on that and telling your story. I mean, I'll share my story a little bit of detail too, but Shonagh, I mean, tell your story on what your lived experiences have been.
Really interesting. I think, for as many people who identify as mixed race, biracial, dual heritage, diverse heritage, you will find a different story. And I say that even within families, because even within families, not necessarily everyone is going to, look the same just because you have the same parentage. That's certainly the case in my home, So my experience of being mixed race, and I use that term because I'm comfortable with that term. We can talk about race being a social construct, and I agree, it is, but here we are living in a world where race and the way you look is important. So I'm comfortable with it. My experience has not been one of not feeling comfortable in my skin. I've always felt very comfortable in the skin that I'm in. I grew up in the 80s. I was born in 77 and grew up in the 80s. And some of the terminology that was used then in the UK was questionable, so we would use terms like coloured and half caste, or me being from the Midlands, half caste, and we would have words like that would somehow be applied to those of us who are mixed race. And I never felt half of anything. I never felt half of anything. I think I always felt comfortable with the food that we ate at home being a blend, of Jamaican food. Sometimes some interesting Irish meals would come our way, and other types of food, and no, I don't speak patois, and I agree with Jennisha on that point. That can be a real sticking point of people wanting you to perform. Can you perform some patois? Well, yeah, I can, but it wouldn't be authentic because that's not how I talk at home. I don't talk in patois. I listen and I can understand. I can communicate with anyone I need to communicate with, but it would be false coming out of my mouth and it wouldn't be true to me. I think where I have struggled, and I think we'll come on to this later, has been around code switching. So I guess allying, I don't know, behaviors, subtle behaviors, human behaviors that come out a bit more depending on who I am around. And, you know, maybe you can see that as a positive, that you're able to kind of change and communicate in quite a fluid way with different groups of people. But also I very much recognize the stories that Jennisha just told. I very much recognize Natalie Morris's thoughts and opinions and experiences and feelings about being mixed race. I get it. And I think I totally understand it, although I may not have the same feelings myself. I see the difficulty, and I also can recognize in myself when I switch, when I become a little bit more Black. You know, I can feel that when my language changes, my slang might change, my gestures might become bigger, and my voice might be a little bit louder. And you know, when I'm at work and maybe surrounded by more white people, yeah, I kind of do code switch. I do find that problematic. I'm not saying that's a good thing. I find that problematic that you can't show up at work as yourself. That's a problem for me. But actually, I think it would be good later on in the conversation as well to talk about the next generation. You know, I'm mixed race, my husband is white, my children are mixed race, but actually their identity is different to mine. And that, I think, is also another conversation about how we use terminology for the next generation. Is that appropriate? Should it matter? Should we just be able to say we're from Jamaica and leave it as red, leave it there? I think are interesting points.
Yeah.
And, you know, I share a lot of what both of you talked about. I mean, for me, I can just go into my story briefly in terms of, you know, growing up as a kid, you know, you're still confused. You still don't know what's going on. You're called the N-word when you're young. You don't see the difference in how you're being treated as a young person as opposed to someone else, especially when you're navigating predominantly white spaces, and yet you can't. You're sitting there and you're not relating to the Black experience. Growing up in social housing, growing up in Lawrence Heights, for those who are from Toronto who know that area quite well, you know, you have that dynamic of, you know, I didn't go to school within the neighborhood. I went to school outside the neighborhood, and that was because that was the only Catholic school that was close by. So that was predominantly Italian and whatnot. So I ended up becoming immersed in European culture, and that's the thing. And my mother protected us from the racism that existed among them. Although she was a very protective woman, you know, I still love her, God rest her soul and whatnot. And you know, and the thing is, and then, you know, as I go up through high school, you start to hear all the other name calling, not all the other names, halfie, half breed, mulatto, and whatnot. So, and then it's just like, you know, how do you navigate those situations? And it's just, and it was very hard for me to figure out, because it was just like, I just kind of just let it go by me, right? Because it's just like, oh, it's nothing there, you know. But at the same time, as you progress in your life, you start to understand that that's the subtle racism that exists from the people that are calling you these names, and they don't understand it. And now when you're starting to call them out, it's like, oh, I'm joking. No, you're not joking. You have to really be cognizant of what you have said and how it affects me and how it affects the other people. Just imagine what you call me, yet on the other people, you know, with other people, what are you saying, or what are you saying to them about their mixed race? And even now, coming in, you know, changing my career, going through urban planning, you start to see, you know, the little bits of you know, the racism that exists within the urban planning profession. Jennisha, you know, you went through the Masters of Environmental Studies, so you know specifically, you know, from an urban planning perspective, how that has been addressed in terms of the policies, the way the housing is built, et cetera, transportation policies, et cetera. And then when I start, even, you know, situations where it's like, you know, for instance, I wanted to look at race and class when it came to the ridership in one organization that I was part of, and it was like, you know, you just get shunned for that because it's a risk for them. So, you know, then you start to really notice that. And now that I'm going through this EDI space and EDI world, you really start to notice this, and you take notice in terms of, you know, how we're being treated. And, you know, and that's why I wrote that blog post about the skin I'm in, because even sometimes, as Jennisha had said, you know, sometimes I go to say to myself, am I Black enough? I mean, yeah, fine. Some people have said, you know, I'm white passing. Even watching that Netflix movie Passing, I couldn't even sit through it because it just made me uncomfortable watching it, right? So at the end of the day, it's, you know, we're starting to understand what this is all about, what racial imposter syndrome is all about. So now, you know, how have we navigated this? And that's something that we really need to understand is, you know, for the both of you, you know, I'm just starting this journey myself and just trying to fully understand what my place is in you know, in this navigating through the spaces that we are in and getting through the, you know, EDI work and whatnot. So, I mean, Shonagh, Jennisha, I mean, how have you navigated through this, you know, through racial imposter syndrome with your own lived experiences and within the work that you do? I mean, this is something that both of you can speak on with respect to that. So whoever wants to lead, go right ahead.
Yeah, so I can start to kind of jump in because it's a complex question. It's also, there's complexity in terms of an answer, right? So when I was younger, navigating racial identity and belonging was very critical to your social capital, right? So thinking about when you're in high school, thinking about when you're in spaces, whether it be communities. I grew up in Parkdale, which at the time, Parkdale in Toronto, at the time was a very heavily immigrant population. And there was a lot of ethnic and racial tensions because it was a bunch of mixed communities all housed in once. And so race relations were very tense and very ever present in this space, right? And in that context, it was very essential for your own survival to identify with a group and pledge allegiance in a particular way. And I perhaps it may not make sense to some folks, but this is like a real experience in terms of growing up in an inner city community that is low income, a lot of different identities and racial backgrounds and immigrant populations coming together, and the ever-present reality of anti-Black racism and anti-immigrant racism at the same time being in the same space. And there was no, at the time when I was growing up with my having to walk quite far to get to school, my father always walked me to school. There was no hiding that my father is Black. And my mother, she's West Indian, she's also dark skinned. So there was no hiding what group you were a part of. You had to essentially find ways to fit in. And so when conversations earlier came up around code switching as a survival mechanism, that was very essential for being able to fit in and to belong. And essentially sacrificing perhaps how you might want to walk through this world in a particular way to be a part of something and to feel as though you're not being ostracized or excluded or bullied for not fitting in. Fast forwarding to where I am now is I intentionally am mindful of what it means to be perhaps coming off as more racially ambiguous than other folks in spaces, and how if you are more able to be identified as quote unquote being Black or quote unquote West Indian, how that may play out in people's trajectories and their experiences with other folks, but also what does that afford me? So I used to look at this as, oh my God, I feel shameful, I feel really bad. I have to look at both sides of where being racially ambiguous does afford folks light skin privilege or privileges that may not be afforded to other folks, and being mindful of that is really important. The other thing I'm also very keen on doing now, because I am able to do this, is I don't play into this proving yourself stuff. I don't have time for it. I don't have energy for it. It actually speaks, it's not important when you think about work environments and places of such nature, especially because of the line of work I do around anti-racism, right? It's this idea of having to prove yourself is not a point of conversation that I'm going to engage in. And actually it's no one's business. It's about getting the work done, right? But I know that those dynamics play out in the workplace in a very a toxic manner, and how people can claim and participate in spaces in a particular way, right? And when it comes to identity. One of the things I think is really important when you're navigating racial imposter syndrome is I try to find ways to provide enough information for folks to understand where I'm coming from and where my experiences, informs my experiences. So my parents and my parental units, my family, people around me. And there's usually a cutoff point in terms of how much I share, because of how much I'm willing to afford folks. And then beyond that, it's more or less, I want you to judge me based on my abilities to uphold equity, anti-racism, and integrity versus what this color of my skin is. And I try to help people look past that in terms of what they think of me. And that is something that we have to do on an everyday basis based on first impressions. People will see you. And if it's not based on, being able to identify you, they try to find ways to ask questions that box you into a colonial picture. And I try not to play into that particular game. So that is what I do as a mechanism to challenge those systems.
I absolutely agree. I think your points there, Jennisha, about, privilege, I think it needs to be acknowledged as well in terms of kind of navigating the space. I think it's changed over time. And like Jennisha, my approach when I was younger is very different to my approach now. And I would certainly say for a number of reasons, I have a very low tolerance of BS, and I don't really feel like I have, I don't have anything to prove, actually. I'm quite comfortable with being myself. But in terms of the world of work, if I focus on my time as an educator, a lot of the things that we do, especially I'm not sure what it's like in the US or in Canada, but in the UK, we spend a lot of time assessing children and looking at attainment and looking at attainment gaps. So, which groups of children are doing better than others. And in many of the schools that I have worked in, but also work with, you've got a group of children who are white and Black Caribbean who are tending to fall well below other groups, even of different Black groups of students. And we need to kind of unpick why that is, why are those groups of children not succeeding. In the UK, 1% of head teachers are Black, 1%. And you are half as likely to be accepted into teacher training according to UCAS than a white woman if you're a Black male. So we've got some massive pieces of work to do here in terms of education. So for me to achieve assistant principal, how did I navigate that space? Well, I've also written on this, and it comes down to hidden workload. And I guess I'm not necessarily talking here about mixed racedness, but that hidden workload of needing to perform very well, needing over preparation, eggshells, having to speak as a monolith for everyone who is not white, and speaking for everybody, having to kind of represent, also being the go-to person for students who are not white. I could go on, but that hidden workload, that emotional labor, I grabbed with both hands at one point and really overwork. And was able to reasonably quickly achieve an assistant principal role, which I'm very, very proud of and continue to be proud of. However, when I reflect on that, I can also see that I'm light-skinned. I'm not sure I would have been appointed into that position had I been darker skinned, had I not been mixed race. There's a very strong possibility that my proximity to whiteness helped me to navigate that space. To that career ladder. There's also that terminology that we sometimes hear used over here, which is a microaggression of oh, aren't you well spoken? Aren't you very eloquent? And what that means is you've got low expectations of people who aren't white, and you're surprised that I can conduct a conversation. That says more about you than it actually does about me. So that kind of, and again, the code switching definitely, I think, helped. But in terms of navigating beyond that into EDI work, a lot of organizations, for obvious reasons now, are reaching out for EDI leaders and need them relatively quickly. I think that, being a woman, not being a white woman, also helps in terms of being able to navigate my way into a space where people can be seen to be being very diverse and very inclusive just because of who they've appointed. if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And that's not to downplay the excellent work that I do with organisations who really want to do the work, and it's about the work. But we have to, as Jennisha was saying, we have to acknowledge that those of us who are mixed race and quite light-skinned are able to navigate some spaces much easier than our Black, dark-skinned women, for example. You know, if you look at the journey Viola Davis has had versus other lighter skinned Black women, you can't, there's just no ignoring the benefits, the perceived benefits. Is that right? Absolutely not. And I use my platform to remind people of it all the time.
Yeah, no, I hear you on that. I mean, I can echo a lot of what the both of you said in terms of the code switching, in terms of, you know, it's, you know, one of the things, before I get to Angela's comment there, you know, even for me, it was like, did I get into these positions because of my light skin background? Would someone from you know, who was darker skinned, who was Black, who would get into those positions, right? And yet they would be passed over. So those things even come through my mind, and then I take a step back, and I'm just like, you know, is it because of my talent? Do I really want to talk? You know, is it really about who I am as a person, or is it just because, you know, there's different mechanisms in place that race is involved, class is involved, et cetera, et cetera. So those are the things that kind of ruminated through my mind going through my career. So now, you know, now we're here, and it's like, we're going to switch the tables here. It's like, it's not just about me and the ease of navigating the system because of the color of my skin, but it's because of the fact that I understand what people who have darker skin than me, who are, you know, they're not able to navigate the system, but I understand and I comprehend and I sympathize with who they are as people and why they haven't been able to go with this. So that's something that I've navigated. So Angela, you know, let's get your comment, unmute yourself, and tell us what you're thinking.
Thank you so much, Andre, and guest speakers. It has been fantastic hearing this conversation today. I am in Calgary, Alberta, and I actually have a similar background to Jennisha in the sense that my father is Jamaican. I was born in Kingston, Jamaica, and was raised by my Ukrainian white mother in Canada. So you're talking, there's so many intersectionalities here in terms of gender perception, societal perception, societal determination as to who you are. Like you, Jennisha, I grew up with everyone thinking that my mother adopted all 3 little Black girls because it was impossible for a white woman to potentially birth 3 children who are not the same color as her. And so I navigated these incredibly difficult spaces growing up. And I really am intrigued by this idea of racial imposter syndrome, insofar that I think in the West, you are defined as an imposter, but culturally, and like a racial imposter, so to speak, because you can't possibly be anything other than X, Y. It's the concrete or the absolutes that define Western thinking, which really are problematic when it comes to the Caribbean. Having grown up between 2 parallel different worlds and literally living in Jamaica, growing up as a child there, back and forth between 2 cultures, as soon as I touched down in Jamaica, you were Jamaican. And granted, now, you know, knowing this, coming back to the West has always been a challenge. Because as soon as I touched down on Canadian soil, it's like, it's either or instead of and. And that's that's what I think I struggle with. So for me, my question to you is, who defines who you are? Growing up now as an adult, as a grown woman living in this culture, I define who I am. As society aside, you know, when you know who you are and the ground that you walk on, the ancestors who came before you, it changes the entire dynamic of this conversation. So how are you defining now who you are? And that's my question to all of you, really.
Well, I'll just basically say, Angela, you know, for me, it's I define myself, plain and simple. And you know, I'm not letting anyone else define who I am. If, you know, I am a Black person, sure, I'm mixed race, but I'm still a Black person. That's who I define myself. And because of the fact that my mother, who was, you know, the strongest person in the household, right? and she's the Trinidadian one. So she was the one who was dominating everything. She was the one who was visible at my school. And I take off after a lot of what she says. And now, you know, going through what I've gone through, I think it's, you know, from not even I think, I know I'm the person who is confident in my skin, and I'm confident in the work that I do, and and I'm confident in basically who I am as a person, plain and simple. And to the both of you, you know, I would hope, or I would imagine that you think the same way.
Yeah, I think now I do. Now I do, yeah. But you know, as a young person, when you're going through puberty and you struggle with your identity anyway, you know, who are we? Who am I? What's my purpose in this world? You know, I remember having a very heated discussion with another mixed race girl who was adopted by two white parents. Now that was difficult for her, you know, and she would describe herself as brown, and I would get in this argument with her. No, you're not, you're black. And we'd have this argument about brown and black. And I guess from my perspective as a young person, no one ever greeted me with, oh, she's half white, ever. No one ever kind of sees a half white person coming into the room, or a half white person coming to interview, or a half white person teaching. What they see is someone who's black or mixed race. They're not really thinking about my whiteness. I do, because my mum's white and she did the child rearing, you know, in the same sense as you were saying there, Andre. So nowadays, though, when I've traveled the world a bit, I've had many friends, I've ditched friends, lost friends. You have certain relationships with different family members. My politics, I'm very clear on. I'm very comfortable in my mixed racedness. I'm very comfortable with serving dinners that have a bit of everything, you know. I'm very comfortable with my musical choices. I'm very comfortable with my hair. And these are, you know, what is culture? What makes our identity? Very hard to kind of pin down, but I'm very, very comfortable with it now. That being said, I don't think I have always 100% been, but I've never kind of felt that need to justify myself too much, really. But maybe that was a lot to do with my mum's upbringing, you know, bringing me up too.
I can quickly jump in. Yeah, thank you for that lovely comment and perspective. I see some stuff in the chat as well from folks. I think for me, when it comes to identifying it, it's about where do you put your values, right? Where do you place what is of importance to you? And for me, my family unit, again, is what's of importance to me. That is where my roots are. That is where my connections are. And if I was to deny my Blackness, then I'd be denying my grandmothers who raised me, who are very strong, prominent people in our family, in our community, right? A lot of the ways in which I move in this world in terms of integrity, in terms of equity, in terms of anti-racism, comes from those very people who may not come with academic degrees, but instilled a lot of values in my life, right? So this is where I'm putting my energy. And I think one of the things that folks should consider, and this is what I go through every single day, is that people are going to read you based on colonial ideologies of what you should look like. What you decide to do and how you put energy in that is really up to you. And if you want to go down that that pathway of having to engage in a game of shame, blame, and proving yourself. And to be honest, I know enough to know that I'm not interested in that trajectory of a conversation, and I'm not willing also to change who I am fundamentally to prove to someone that I am what I'm trying to claim. That is for them. That sounds like something that they need to walk through and work through in their own forms of being colonized around what Blackness looks like, what does indigeneity look like, what does what does it mean to be mixed race, what all those things, right? And I think until we get to that place where folks are like, I'm not engaging in this and I'm not going to give it attention, what I will give attention to is the fact that anti-Black racism exists and racism exists, and those are things that we should probably put our intention in versus lateral violence within communities and external people trying to impose ideologies on you. I think we won't shift the conversation fully, and I think that's what we need to do. So I'm not here for those conversations where people are saying, you're not Black enough, or back home in my country, you would be ridiculed for acting in particular ways, because in all the ways in which they're talking, they're not just talking about racial identity, they're talking about ideas of sexuality, ideas of what it means to be a woman, ideas what it means to be westernized versus perhaps being culturally from back home. And a lot of times folks don't understand your own lived experiences and don't want to listen to it. So why engage with folks that are not here for actually learning and appreciating perhaps where you're coming from? So that's kind of where I am. And the one thing I do share with folks and do try to kind of get to a place of understanding is, if there's one thing that you want to do in these situations, is around self-preservation. How do you preserve self so that you can continue doing the things that you want to do around this work, versus engaging in processes that could be incredibly damaging, toxic, and violent for you in terms of belonging and inclusion.
Okay, that's, you know what, that kind of closes, basically gets us to our last points in terms of strategies and solutions for not only how we've navigated, and which we've talked about, but also for those who are in the audience who are just new to understanding what racial imposter syndrome is, and who haven't really used it or understood it in their practices. So what strategies, and solutions have you been able to come up with when it comes to dealing with racial imposter syndrome, and what are the lessons learned for equity practitioners to actually to address this and provide a solution and put it within their everyday work? So, I mean, we've talked about it from our lived experiences, what we've been able to, how we've navigated and provided those solutions to that. So what are the key strategies? I mean, I know, Shonagh, you were talking about that in terms of practical strategies and advice for employees and employers in terms of addressing this issue. So tell us what your thoughts are in terms of this.
So I think there's two main kind of points, really. First of all, on a personal level, how do we as individuals navigate spaces and look after ourselves? And certainly I've really exercised my right to say no. So if I don't feel like I want to go into that place, it looks like it might not be welcoming for me, I'm not going in there. I don't have to put myself in a position where I will feel vulnerable. So I don't, I just won't do it. But also in terms of sensible things, try to preempt the challenges of different situations and trying to factor in, who are the drains in your life, who are the radiators, and trying to kind of spend more time with those people who aren't trying to pigeonhole you and hold you to a certain standard in their view, their perceptions of what your behavior should be like, or your thinking and your identity should be like. And stripping away some of those drains, I think, is really important. Preparation, so really preparing for situations. If I know I'm going to be doing, for example, some difficult training on race or cumulative effective racism, for example, then I need to really think about what's happening before I'm doing that piece of work, and what am I going to do after that piece of work. And it might be that the after bit is about nourishment. And when I talk about nourishment, I'm not just about food, I'm talking about reading, going out into the environment, having a bath. How do we refill? And then, being really discerning about who we choose to associate with and where we work. And of course, when we talk about where we work, that's harder, because we've all got to put food on the table, haven't we? We've all got to, sometimes make those difficult choices. But where we can, I think being careful about, who do we give our time to? What tasks do we give our time to? Where are your red lines? Being really clear about your boundaries and setting those early, I think, is really important. And finally, final thought is about self-reflection. So taking some time to just reflect on who you are, so that you can show up authentically. So kind of resetting. So again, who am I again? What do I like? What are my thoughts on these sorts of things? Resetting so that you can live out your life, have those relationships, personal and work relationships, with authenticity.
And Jennisha, what are your thoughts? I mean, do you echo a lot of what Shonagh said? Or?
Oh, absolutely. I think lots of echoing of what I've heard. I think one of the things that I'll echo again is just like, you have choices to engage and not engage, and I think it's really important to be very boundaried when it comes to things around race and race relations, and race as a social construct, but also something that's very politically charged, and knowing how to, when and how you might want to engage in those conversations. The other larger thing also is institutionally, when you work in spaces, right? There is also obligation for employers and there are people holding space, which brings together diverse communities to talk about how are we going to work together as a diverse community of people in this space, right? How are we going to be aware of decolonizing practices, anti-racism practices, the ways in which immigration inform and or intersectionality inform people's identities, and how we hold space, share space, and talk about these different topics. This is very important when you're working in EDI, our spaces, but also educational spaces, spaces that are service providers to other communities. And I'm thinking about the intersections of not just like race, but also gender identity, class, about one's ability, right? In terms of ableism and different forms in which we exclude people, not just based on the race, but these other identities that we hold, right? And what other conversations look like? And if they're unidimensional conversations just about race over here, and over here we're going to talk about, disability justice, then we're not doing justice to these topics, because we don't, like Audre Lorde says, we don't live one-dimensional lives, right? So I think that's maybe a good way for, instead of people having to be put on the spot to talk about who they are improving themselves, shift the conversations to institutionally. How are we having these conversations to change in the ways we operate in and support diverse individuals and folks with intersecting identities work in this space, thrive in this space, and feel like they're a part of this space. And then beyond that, I'm a huge believer of trauma work. I think we live in a world right now where everything is super sensitive and super political across the board. And we often are not afforded time to step away, to think, process, and to come back to a situation, because we also operate from a quick response approach where if something bad happens, we need to have an answer right away. And I think a part of being mindful and a part of doing justice to anti-racism work, or doing justice to conversations around race relations and intersectionality is around slowing it down and giving and affording the time it requires, because it is a very complex and loaded conversation. And when we start looking at things in those ways, perhaps we'll get to a place where we can really have these conversations in meaningful ways that don't cut people off, don't shut things down, but really get us to a space of moving forward in the conversation. Those are the things I would share. And just letting folks know, like, if you're experiencing shame and blame, or shame and not feeling authentic to yourself, it's just not taking on the projections of other people's assumptions of what it means to be Indigenous, what it means to be Black, what it means to be this, right? And owning your own identities in the ways that you want to be identified in those particular spaces.
Thanks for that. And you know what, those are excellent points for us to consider as equity practitioners, or even those who are not in the field, but at least have have some sort of where they have to use an EDI lens within the work that they do. So I want to, I think they're still here, Greg, Cynthia, Rose, I know you've made some comments. If you want to chime in, unmute yourself and talk about your experiences. If you have questions to or comments, or anyone else in the room, feel free to unmute yourselves and join the conversation for the last 9 minutes or so. Unless they don't want to, but Cynthia, go ahead.
Hi, Andre. Hi. This is a very interesting topic, and I am very grateful to have had the opportunity to be here today to listen to all of you. Putting on my leadership and management hat, I work for the county in LA, and I just wanted to know, I'm Puerto Rican, but I'm a light-skinned Puerto Rican. My brother identifies as Afro-Latino. My family, we're basically a kaleidoscope of, different, we all look different. And when I first came to LA, it was a real shock for me. a culture shock, not only that, but also in terms of, race and discrimination and all these different things, and just seeing the differences in how I was treated versus my brother. So, of course I have some of that, but as I try to mentor staff and I try to, build the next generation of leadership, how can I encourage my staff to be supportive when they encounter a situation, when they see somebody engaging in questioning somebody's race and identity? Like, how can we start having those conversations and start building that support? That's my question.
Yeah, that's a really great question. I'll jump in and then hand it off to someone else. But I think bottom line is we're talking about relationships, right? You have a staffing team that they're all in relationship with each other and to some extent, and a big part of relationships is trust. If there is no trust with one another, you can't actually have these conversations that are incredibly sensitive and can be very triggering and such for folks, because we often get into this process of the victim villain, scenario where someone says something and it's taken offensively, and there's no room for conversations or looking at it perhaps, or coming to it in a different way, right? And I think a part of our team is at the foundation is, how do we want, like, again, setting the stage of who are we, where are we coming from, how are we going to work together, how do we build trust, so that when we get to those places where what I call crucial conversations are needed, not difficult, they're crucial because they need to go to the next step. In order for us to get to the crucial conversation, you have to have a foundation of trust. If you don't, then you're not going to be able to get people on the same page where they're not, so that they can heal from, the experience and deal with the trauma and to deal with, the offense they have caused. And a part of this is emotional intelligence that people need, but also self-awareness. If there's no self-awareness of the members of your team of who they are and where they're coming from and how they relate to other people in this space, then they won't understand how their actions actually have impact. I'll give you an example. Typically when you meet new people, they'll ask questions like, where are you from? Are you married? All these things. For someone you might outside, and depending on the space you're in, those questions may be appropriate or not appropriate. And how does the person know who's asking the questions that these questions are appropriate or not? If this is what they're accustomed to and are normal. But if they come into a space where that is not normal and that is not okay, it automatically brings people to this place where they're in opposition, where questions of personal details are being asked and it's inappropriate, but the person who's asking the question may not know, or they may know, but they've never been afforded that crucial conversation to know that this is not probably the best way to go about these questions and or ask these questions or the space for it. So I think, again, I'll bring it back to trust, knowing where people are coming from, self-awareness before you can even engage in those highly sensitive conversations, and also asking the question of, why are these questions important to ask?
I absolutely agree with that, Jennisha. I think, when you have those introductions, if you feel you really, you want to get to know someone, I always kind of go with a really vanilla question like, tell me about yourself. And that way that person can tell you what they want to tell you. They don't have to be filling out your agenda. So that's one thing. But to your question, Cynthia, about how to stop, what you should do, I always kind of go back to that phrase that we use in education a lot, which is whatever you don't challenge, you're accepting. So if you're standing there in silence when you can see that there's a microaggression kind of taking place, then you're complicit. And that can be really difficult for people to understand, that you're saying nothing. That means you're maintaining the status quo, which in itself is discriminatory. Do you see what I mean? So I think, for me, there are a couple of sentence starters that you can kind of use, which might be, can I just stop you there? It sounds like, and you might want to extend that by saying, can I just stop you there? It sounds like you're trying to get this person to explain their whole life story to you. Let's not do that, and stand up for them and identify that. Feels a bit like a microaggression. It feels a bit of an intrusive question. Sometimes I have seen people kind of check in and say, can I stop you there? Cynthia, are you okay with this line of questioning? And really it's about kind of what you feel comfortable saying, but certainly doing nothing is complicit. So you need to find a way to interrupt that behavior so that everyone knows that it's not okay.
One of the things I'll just quickly add to that is positions of power. So Cynthia, you had said that you are the manager of folks, and your position of power may play a role in how engaged folks may be in setting the stage, and also processes and also expectations. So power dynamics are critical, and oftentimes where you see microaggressions of this nature play out is when perhaps management is making these comments and staff don't feel okay saying anything out of fear of being a reprisal and or being treated differently, or whatever the case may be. So I think a critical part of this is, as a team, how do we equip folks with the skills to check in with folks, to be what I would call bystander intervention or active witnessing and active listening, which leads to action, and also creating that space where if the concern needs to be brought to management, then management will actually listen deeply and respond accordingly to the concerns that are brought. But I think a part of this is, I come back to the self-awareness piece, is sometimes these things happen and folks are not at the space where they can take feedback in a really good way, and it's projected through then relationships. And so grounding those spaces in good relationships and having trust and understanding where people are coming from would hopefully carve a pathway forward to have these difficult conversations when microaggressions come up, because we know they will, because you're with a group of people that are constantly diverse, constantly changing, and there needs to be room for forgiveness and for opportunities to have those discussions to get to a place of understanding.
Actually, there we go. Yeah, so, this was an amazing talk. I really enjoyed it. I mean, like I said, I'm just getting into this space, but it was great to learn from the both of you, and the audience, pretty much, I wouldn't say pretty much, they loved what you had to say. And, I know that Greg wanted to get a comment in here. I see that Megana Voluptas, she had a question, which I'm sure it was answered. And I want to thank Angela for her question and comment about her lived experience. And so thanks to everyone. We'll end this on a positive with what you're doing. So I just want to conclude by just asking both of you, Shonagh and Jennisha, where can they find you on social media, and go from there.
Twitter. I'm on Twitter. I'm not super active, but I will respond to one-off messages. As I said, my previous work, again, folks, was like super confidential, super around safety. So I'm not very heavily in posting on social media, but I am live. I will respond. So if you find me on Twitter, I'm happy to connect. And I'll drop my my email in the chat if folks do want to chat in a more formal setting.
Shonagh?
And I'm on Twitter. And it's at, and then there's a line, Shonagh Reid. And then I'm also on LinkedIn, much more straightforward. Just type my name in there and it'll come up. I don't really do Instagram. I'm on there, but lower your expectations of my performance on that platform. But yeah, you can, please do reach out.
All right, well, thanks for everyone for attending. Watch for the next Urban Equity Chats. It's actually going to be in a couple of weeks, where we're going to be talking about an exciting discussion on where does EDI fall within an organization. And so with that, I close it for today. Thank you for everyone. Thank you, Jennisha. Thank you, Shonagh, for your great discussion, your answering the questions, sharing your lived experiences, and how we navigate and succeed as equity practitioners in dealing with racial equity, racial imposter syndrome. All right, thanks for everyone for attending, and take care, everyone. Thanks again.